Hi, I'm Cole Allen, and I am a policy analyst at the Oklahoma Policy Institute. Oklahoma Policy Institute is a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank that researches and advocates for equitable and fiscally responsible policies to benefit all Oklahomans. Today, I'll be talking about the Citizens Initiative process, or you might also know it as the state question process in Oklahoma, and how it serves as the foundation of our democracy. I'll first talk about the founding of Oklahoma as a state and the role that the Citizens Initiative played in our framers' creation of our Constitution. Then I'll look over the past 116 years since 1907 at how the process has remained the same mostly, but also had some subtle changes. And then I'll close by taking a deeper dive into the past decade and how the state question process has been used and been viewed by Oklahomans. So Oklahoma became a state in 1907. And when we became a state, our framers wrote into our Constitution the ability and the right for Oklahomans, everyday Oklahomans like you and me, to use the Citizens Initiative process, which is a tool that allows people to write and propose and even directly vote on laws and changes to the Constitution and statute. Oklahoma is one of 24 states that has given its people this right in its constitution. And we were actually the sixth state in the country to do this. If you look at this map of states that have the Citizens Initiative, you can see that most of the states are west of the Mississippi River. And this is because history has played a big part in why we in Oklahoma have this right. You see, our framers, the people who wrote our Constitution, were heavily led by this political idea of populism, or the thought that everyday people, the average Joe or Jane, should have their interests, their wants, and needs reflected in the policies that affect their lives. And this idea of populism was really, really prevalent during the time period of westward expansion, meaning that most of the states west of the Mississippi River have the Citizens Initiative granted to their people in the Constitution. Our framers really wanted to make sure that everyday people could be represented in their democracy by their legislators and their governors, but also had the ability to write, propose, and vote on laws directly if they so wanted. They even wrote in our Constitution, in Article 5, Section 1, that the people reserve to themselves the power to propose laws and amendments to the Constitution and to enact or reject the same at the polls, independent of the legislature. The framers of the Oklahoma Constitution put in there at the foundation of our lawmaking process that the people's vote and their voice matters the most. This process doesn't oppose a legislature or the legislative process, but rather it complements it and ensures that it reflects the interests of the people who are affected by these laws. In the 116 years since this was written into our Constitution, Oklahomans have continuously demonstrated their desire to have a say in the policies that affect their lives. They have done this by making frequent but judicious use of this constitutionally guaranteed right of the Citizens Initiative. Since 1907, there have been a total of 832 state questions filed at the time that I'm recording this video, and over half of these have been citizen-led initiatives and referenda. The initiatives are citizen proposed changes to the Constitution or the statute, and the referenda are vetoes to recently passed laws by the legislature. For the past 116 years, Oklahomans, through this process of putting out initiatives, have written to the Secretary of State requesting this policy change, have gathered signatures to demonstrate the interest of their fellow Oklahomans in having a vote on this, have worked with the courts and other agencies to ensure that their proposed language is up to the task. And then ultimately, if they have collected enough signatures and gone through the courts properly, have been able to vote directly on these issues at the polls. A little less than half have also been given by the legislature. around 343, which means that the legislature has referred some questions, typically constitutional changes, to the people to have a direct vote on themselves. This process that I've described has been relatively unchanged over the past 116 years. There have only been three constitutional amendments that have changed this process on that level, most notably setting in stone that a simple majority can either accept or reject one of the proposed changes of a state question, and most recently setting a signature threshold based on the most recent gubernatorial or governor vote that has helped people be more sure of how many signatures they need to collect. In addition to constitutional amendments, there have also been a number of smaller statutory amendments over the years that have maintained the core of the process as it was written into our statute in 1910 by amending and adding sections as needed to keep it updated and usable by people, making sure that it's accessible, effective, and usable by everyday Oklahomans to make sure that their voices are heard. In 2009, for example, there was House Bill 2246, which was written by two Republicans, Representative Terrell from Moore and Senator Brogdon from Owasso. They wanted to update the signature collection period time, which has been 90 days for Oklahoma's history. But they wanted to bring it up to 1 year, which is much more in line with the national average. Seeing that since the 90-day threshold or 90-day signature gathering period was written into law, our population has dramatically increased and our geographic distribution has changed as well. They understood that the 90 days that we give people to collect signatures for their initiatives is just too short. So they wrote this bill, House Bill 2246, to extend that period of time to a year, which received sweeping bipartisan support in the House and the Senate, which is very rare in Oklahoma politics nowadays. But it was ultimately vetoed by Governor Brad Henry, who was a Democrat at the time. This move and writing this bill shows us that throughout our history, even up into recent 21st century Oklahoma politics, everyday Oklahomans and lawmakers alike have sought to keep the process a usable and effective tool to have people's voices heard. This is just what our founders intended, having people have their direct voice heard both in the signature gathering, the writing of these bills, and ultimately the voting of these changes at the ballot box. Over the past decade, Oklahomans' enjoyment of the Citizens Initiative and the state question process more largely has continued. We may remember this past March in 2023 when State Question 820, the recreational marijuana state question, was put up on the ballot in a special election set by Governor Stitt. This state question had very low turnout at about 25% among voters, and we can see that this isn't actually an outlier in terms of turnout over the past decade when we compare it against other state questions. Looking at all the state questions that have been on the ballot in the past decade and all their elections, March 2023 had by far the lowest turnout and is really an outlier when we think about people's interests and use of the state question process at the ballot, especially in general elections. In presidential years, we can see very high turnout that is extremely similar to the turnout of the highest ranking, maybe the presidential or congressional turnout that we see. People are interested in this process. They want their voice heard as much as they want their voice heard as their vote for president or governor or their local representatives. People could have simply rolled off or just not voted for this state question, which is at the bottom of the ballot typically. But they took the time in these mini elections to go all the way to the bottom and vote for these measures at essentially the same rate as they did for the high ticket items. People are interested in the state question, and the one election in March 2023 is not necessarily indicative of how much people in Oklahoma care and use the state question process to have their voices heard. Turnout isn't the only indicator of Oklahoma's enjoyment to their right for direct democracy. Oklahoma Policy Institute in the summer of 2023, we conducted listening sessions across the state in urban and rural counties with very different populations. And as part of this, we ask people what their hopes and concerns are for Oklahoma, what they care about, what they think about different policy issues. And we ask them to fill out a survey in which they rank their priorities for different policy areas, including Oklahoma's democracy. When we asked participants, we saw that over 50% of respondents ranked protecting the state question as their first or second priority, with the number one, the highest ranked thing, most people putting that as their number one concern or their number one issue. Oklahomans really deeply care about the state question process. In urban, in rural, and suburban parts of Oklahoma, this is a very concerning issue for people. They want to make sure that their voices are heard, that their voice is valued, and that their interests are reflected in our laws and our lawmaking process. Today, Oklahomans across the state want to make sure that their constitutionally guaranteed right to the Citizens Initiative stays usable, accessible, and effective. And they're worried that recent changes in laws or proposed changes threaten that. These concerns of losing the power of the Citizens Initiative echo across Oklahoma's history as a state. Our history informs us that our founders, the framers of our Constitution, saw direct democracy, people voting directly on issues that mattered to them, as the foundation of Oklahoma's laws. That doesn't work in contrast to the legislature, but works in companionship to it, works alongside it to produce the most effective, the most representative laws for the most people. It has been a proven tool to protect the consent of the governed in our state, where if the majority of voters approve of a measure, it gets passed. And if the majority of voters disapprove of a measure, it fails. This is the core of what lawmaking should be, and our framers understood that and wanted to see it given as a tool for people. Across the past 116 years and over this past decade, it's been well used and well loved by Oklahomans across the state, showing interest, especially when it's been given to them alongside of other important votes like their vote for president or governor. They have demonstrated their interest in continuing the use for the state question process. Our founders saw a vision of an Oklahoma where, regardless of someone's income, their education, or their geography, an Oklahoman could have a direct role in the making of the laws that affect their life. Our framers gave us the tool of the Citizens Initiative and the state question process to make that happen. As we continue to grow as a state, we should take this opportunity to keep this vision of our framers a reality by protecting the accessibility and the effectiveness of one of the greatest tools of Oklahoma's democracy, the state question. I want to thank you for listening to me today. If you have any questions, my contact information is on the screen, and I would love to speak with you about how important the state question process is to Oklahoma's democratic process and why it's important that we keep it effective and accessible for Oklahomans. Thank you.